Settle in and let the gentle hum of history lull you into a state of calm. As you drift in your comfortable bed, ever wondered how vastly different the concept of rest was not so long ago? If you find this oddly relaxing, perhaps consider a gentle tap on the like button, or subscribe for more soothing journeys into the past. Where in the world are you, and what time is it for you? As we prepare to step back tonight, we drift into the era of steam and struggle to understand why it truly sucked to be a factory worker during the Industrial Revolution. Close your eyes, and let's begin. Before factories and machines, life moved to a softer beat. Picture a world mostly green, where people lived in small villages, not big cities. The sun dictated their days, and nature's sounds filled the air. Wind in crops, distant cattle, birds at dawn. Life was tied to the soil, each season bringing its tasks, challenges, and quiet rewards. This was a world deeply connected to the earth, where the pace of life was gentle, unhurried, and profoundly natural, a stark contrast to the era that was dawning just over the horizon, waiting to reshape everything in its path. Life was a cycle: planting, tending, harvesting. Spring meant tilling and sowing. Long summer days were for nurturing crops and making hay. Autumn brought the harvest, hard work but also communal joy. Winter, though harsh, was for mending, storytelling, and rest for land and people before the cycle restarted. This predictable, natural cadence had governed human existence for countless generations. Each turn of the season was familiar, understood, a reliable framework around which all activities and even thoughts were structured, a deep comfort in its own way. It wasn't an easy existence. Labor was constant, sunrise to sunset. Bad weather could ruin harvests and lives. Sickness was common, remedies basic. Yet there was a different structure. People knew their roles in families and villages. Community was strong. Neighbors relied on each other. Life was tough, certainly, with its share of fear and uncertainty, but it also possessed an inherent order, a sense of belonging that came from shared experience and mutual dependence. This interconnectedness formed the very bedrock of their society, a quiet strength in a challenging world. Common lands were vital for many. Shared pastures, woods, and fields allowed villagers to graze animals, gather firewood, forage, or cultivate small plots. These commons were a safety net, helping poorer families supplement their living, keep a cow for milk or geese for eggs. It offered a degree of self-sufficiency, not wealth, but a buffer against the year's uncertainties. This ancient system was woven into rural society, an unspoken right that supported the delicate balance of village life for centuries, providing a crucial resource for those with little else to their name. Then a slow, profound change began, the Enclosure Acts. These parliamentary acts, from the 18th to 19th centuries, mandated fencing off common lands. The aim was often agricultural efficiency, creating larger private farms for supposedly greater food production. Piece by piece, open fields and shared resources that defined rural life for generations were divided, hedged, and walled off. What was once for all became for the few. The very landscape, so familiar and seemingly immutable, began to transform under these new laws, altering boundaries both physical and social. The impact of enclosure was deeply disruptive. While some landowners benefited, smaller families lost traditional rights. The common ground for their cow, the woods for fuel, the pasture for sheep, all vanished into private holdings. Without these resources, self-sufficiency dwindled. The old ways of life, built on shared access and mutual support, started to fray. For many, it was not just a loss of land, but a loss of security, a loss of a way of being that had sustained their ancestors. The invisible threads holding their world together were being systematically cut. With livelihoods eroded, many rural families faced a stark choice: deepen poverty or leave home. A reluctant migration began, from familiar green countryside to growing towns and cities. These places were transforming too, chaotically, with emerging industry. The air grew heavy with coal smoke, the sounds not of nature, but of construction, hammers, and the unsettling rumble of early machines. It was a journey into the unknown, a departure from all that was familiar, driven by necessity rather than hope. A quiet exodus from a fading world into the heart of an emerging one. The landscape changed. Open fields became fenced. Stark factory silhouettes punctuated horizons, chimneys like new, imposing trees of brick. The gentle, cyclical rhythm of agriculture, which had governed life for millennia, faced a new competitor. A different tempo emerged, dictated not by sun and seasons, but by the unyielding demands of production. The once dominant sounds of the countryside began to be drowned out. What happens, we must ask, when the ancient familiar rhythm of the farm is slowly, inexorably replaced by the relentless, clamorous clatter of machines? The journey from the fading green of the countryside, as we've seen, often ended at the threshold of these new, imposing structures. For those arriving, bewildered and dispossessed, the first sight of a manufactory, as they were often called, must have been a shock. These were not the familiar low-slung cottages or barns of their past. Instead, stark, utilitarian buildings rose against the smoky sky, monuments of brick and, increasingly, of iron, their many windows staring out like countless, unblinking eyes. They represented a new kind of power, a new way of organizing life and labor, utterly alien to anything known before. In the early days of this industrial dawn, before steam became king, the lifeblood of these nascent factories was water. Giant water wheels, some reaching enormous diameters, harnessed the steady, powerful flow of rivers and streams. Mills, particularly for textiles, clustered along riverbanks, their very existence dictated by the geography of water power. It was here that innovations like Richard Arkwright's water frame found their home, a machine designed to spin cotton into strong yarn, too large and too power-hungry for a cottage, demanding this new, centralized approach to production. This reliance on water power shaped the early industrial landscape. Mill towns sprang up in valleys, often in previously remote locations, wherever a river could be dammed or its flow channeled effectively. The river, once a natural boundary or a source for gentle irrigation, now became a tireless engine. Its constant murmur, once a soothing backdrop to rural life, was amplified by the groan and splash of the great wheels, a persistent reminder of the power that drove the looms and spindles within, day in and day out, regardless of season or sunlight, as long as the water flowed. But the rain of water, powerful as it was, had its limitations. Rivers could freeze in winter or run low in summer. A more reliable, more versatile source of power was needed for industry to truly unbind itself from the landscape. This came in the form of steam. While early steam engines existed, it was James Watt's crucial improvements in the 1760S and 70S, particularly the separate condenser, that transformed the steam engine into a truly efficient prime mover for industry. Suddenly, factories could be built almost anywhere, closer to raw materials, to coal fields, or to burgeoning city populations. The steam engine became the beating heart of this new industrial age. Housed often in its own sturdy engine house, it was a creature of fire and water, of smoke and hissing steam. The rhythmic thump and roar of the engine, the gleaming dance of its pistons and beams, the glowing maw of its furnace constantly fed with coal. These were sights and sounds that both mesmerized and intimidated. It was a tangible symbol of human ingenuity subduing natural forces, a relentless power source that could work tirelessly, demanding only fuel and maintenance in return. These new factories, whether powered by water or steam, shared a common characteristic. They were built for purpose, and that purpose was mass production. Typically, they were multi-story brick buildings, their interiors vast, open spaces designed to accommodate rows upon rows of machinery. Light, such as it was, filtered in through numerous small paned windows, often clouded with grime and dust. Wooden floors, soon to be soaked with oil and water, supported the weight of iron frames and the ceaseless vibration of 100 moving parts. They were, in essence, functional shells for the machines they contained. The scale of the machinery itself was a world away from the spinning wheels or hand looms of domestic industry. Iron frames, complex arrangements of gears, belts, and rollers stretched across the factory floor. These were not tools wielded by a craftsman's hand, but intricate systems that themselves dictated the pace and nature of work. A single machine could now do the work of many hands, and these machines were arrayed in intimidating numbers, each a station in a long, interconnected process of production. The individual felt small, almost insignificant amidst such mechanical grandeur. And then there was the noise. It is perhaps difficult for us, in our relatively quieter age, to truly comprehend the sonic environment of an early factory. It was not merely loud, it was an overwhelming, unceasing cacophony. The rhythmic clatter of countless looms, the whir and shriek of spindles, the hiss and groan of steam engines, the slap of leather belts on driving wheels, the rumble of gears, all combined into a deafening roar that filled every corner of the building. Conversation was often impossible, reduced to shouts or hand signals, the sound of physical presence that battered the eardrums. Beyond the relentless noise, the factory assaulted other senses too. The air was often thick with dust, cotton fluff in textile mills, metallic particles in ironworks, making breathing difficult and coating every surface with a fine grime. The smell of machine oil, hot metal, and sometimes harsh chemicals used in processing, mingled with the odor of unwashed bodies working in close proximity. Add to this the heat, especially near steam engines or in poorly ventilated rooms packed with machinery and people, and the factory environment became a truly jarring, physically oppressive place to spend one's waking hours. So why, one must ask, did people choose to enter such places, to subject themselves to these conditions? The answer for the vast majority was stark and simple: desperation. As we have touched upon, the old ways of life in the countryside were disappearing. The common lands were enclosed, traditional crafts undercut by mass production, and agricultural work itself was becoming more precarious. For many, the choice was not between a pleasant life in factory work, but between factory work and utter destitution, starvation, or the dreaded workhouse. The factory, for all its horrors, offered something that was becoming increasingly rare: the prospect of a wage, however meager. In a world where money was needed for rent, for food, for fuel, the chance to earn even a few shillings a week was a powerful lure. It might not promise comfort or even health, but it promised a means, however tenuous, of holding body and soul together. This cash nexus, this relationship based purely on wages for labor, was itself a profound shift from the more complex, often non-monetary relationships of the rural past. Often it wasn't just individuals but entire families who sought work in the mills and factories. If the father's earnings were insufficient, which they frequently were, then mothers and children too would be forced to seek employment within those same deafening walls. The factory owners, in fact, often preferred women and children for certain tasks, as they could be paid even less than adult men and were often considered more docile or nimble-fingered. The family unit, once a unit of production in the home or field, now became a unit of wage earners within the factory system. It is crucial to remember the almost complete lack of alternatives. There was no comprehensive social safety net as we understand it today. Parish relief, the old system of poor support, was often punitive and inadequate, designed to deter rather than assist. To fall out of work, to be unable to earn, was to face a terrifying abyss. The factory gates therefore represented not an appealing option, but often the only visible path away from hunger and homelessness. It was a choice made under duress, a submission to necessity in a rapidly changing and unforgiving world. Within these new industrial cathedrals, a new type of human laborer was being forged: the worker, the operative, the hand. This was a subtle but profound shift. An artisan of the old order possessed skills, owned their tools, often controlled their pace of work, and sold a finished product. A factory worker, by contrast, sold only their time and their labor. They performed a specific, often repetitive task in a larger process, a cog in the great machine. Skill was often less valued than endurance and obedience. This was the birth of the industrial proletariat. Life within the factory was governed by a new and rigid discipline, entirely alien to the rhythms of agricultural life or independent craft work. Time was no longer measured by the sun or the seasons, but by the factory clock and the shrill blast of the whistle. Punctuality was strictly enforced, lateness punished. Work was relentless, paced by the machines themselves with few breaks. Overseers patrolled the floors, ensuring continuous labor. This was a new kind of serfdom, not to a feudal lord, but to the machine and the demands of production. And so, from these shared experiences, the deafening noise, the oppressive conditions, the loss of autonomy, the meager wages, and the iron discipline, a new social entity began to coalesce. People who had once been farmers, weavers, spinners, or blacksmiths, defined by their diverse rural origins or specific crafts, now found a common identity in their shared role as factory laborers. This was the crucible in which a modern working class was formed, its consciousness shaped by the daily realities of this new industrial world. Their story, their struggle, was just beginning. Having entered the factory gates, driven by necessity into this new world of ceaseless noise and relentless machinery, the workers were confronted with perhaps the most immediate and brutal reality of their new existence: the sheer, unyielding length of the working day. The rhythms of the sun, the moon, the seasons, these ancient governors of human activity held little sway here. A new master dictated the hours, a new pulse measured out the moments of life, and its demands were insatiable, stretching wakefulness to its very limits. Dominating this new regime of time was the factory clock. Its face, often large and starkly visible, and its accompanying bell or whistle marked the true divisions of the day. This was the relentless tick-tock that ruled your life, an impartial and unforgiving arbiter. No longer did the fading light signal the end of toil, nor the crowing rooster its beginning. Instead, the mechanical call to labor and the equally abrupt signal to cease, if cease it ever truly did, governed every waking, working moment, slicing life into precise, monetized units of effort. For most factory workers during the early to mid-industrial revolution, a working day of 12 to 14 hours was not uncommon. Indeed, it was often the standard. Imagine rising before dawn, a hurried, meager meal, and then the trek through darkened streets to the factory gates, where the machines were already stirring or waiting. Then, hour upon hour of repetitive, demanding labor, stretching far beyond what any agricultural worker, even in peak harvest, would typically endure, day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. And these already grueling 12 or 14 hours could, and often did, stretch even further. During busy periods, to meet a rush order or simply at the whim of the owner eager to maximize output from expensive machinery, the day could extend to 16 hours. Sometimes, shifts were even longer, especially in industries that required continuous processes. This was not overtime in the modern sense of chosen extra work for enhanced pay. It was an expected extension, with refusal risking dismissal the ultimate threat. It meant that for many months of the year, workers would see daylight only through the grimy windows of the factory, if at all. They toiled sun-up to sundown and often long after, arriving at the factory before the sun had risen and leaving it long after the sun had set. Their lives became a cycle of dim, artificial light or outright darkness, punctuated by the brief, exhausted slumber before the whistle blew again, calling them back to the machines before the world outside had properly woken. The concept of a weekend, a period of extended rest and leisure, was largely unknown. The factory demanded labor 6 days a week. Sunday might offer a partial respite, often grudgingly given, but even this was not guaranteed. Maintenance work, essential cleaning of machinery, or urgent production needs could easily encroach upon this one potential day of rest. The relentless pace of production paused for little, ensuring that human energy was extracted with maximum efficiency throughout the week, week after weary week. Breaks within this colossal working day were scant and brief, perhaps a short pause for a midday meal, often eaten whilst still at the workstation, amidst the dust, grime, and relentless noise of the machinery. There was no quiet canteen, no moment of genuine recuperation. Food, often poor and insufficient, was consumed hastily, the primary focus remaining on the task at hand. Any unauthorized pause, any lingering, risked the wrath of the overseer and the docking of precious wages. Or worse, this was not merely about the length of time spent within the factory walls, it was about the intensity of the labor performed during those hours. The machines, powered by tireless water or steam, set a pace that human bodies struggled to maintain. There was no room for the varied tasks of agricultural work, the moments of leaning on a spade, or the natural breaks between efforts. Here the effort was continuous, the task often mind-numbingly repetitive, demanding constant attention to avoid accidents or errors in production. The physical toll of standing or performing repetitive motions for 12, 14, or even 16 hours a day was immense. Legs swelled, backs ached, and hands grew raw or calloused. For children, whose bodies were still developing, the strain often led to permanent deformities. Stunted growth, twisted spines, and bowed legs were common sights among those who had spent their formative years in the mills. The human body was treated as just another component of the machine, subject to wear and tear. Chronic exhaustion became the normal state of being for many factory workers. It was a weariness that went beyond simple tiredness, seeping into the very bones, dulling the senses and clouding the mind. They existed in a perpetual state of fatigue, where the brief hours away from the factory were barely enough to consume a meal and fall into a heavy, unrefreshing sleep before the cycle began anew. This profound exhaustion was a defining feature of their daily struggle for survival. This relentless overwork, combined with poor nutrition and unsanitary living conditions, had a devastating impact on physical health. Weakened constitutions made workers susceptible to diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid, which thrived in the overcrowded new industrial towns. The sheer exhaustion compromised immune systems, and the dangerous working environments led to frequent injuries that, without proper medical care, could prove fatal or permanently disabling. Life expectancy in many industrial areas was shockingly low. The mental and emotional toll was just as significant, though harder to quantify. The monotony of the tasks, the lack of autonomy, the constant noise, and the overwhelming fatigue left little room for intellectual stimulation or emotional expression. Life was reduced to a grim cycle of work, eat, and sleep. The vibrant human spirit, which thrives on variety, purpose, and connection, was ground down by the sheer, unyielding drudgery of these endless days, fostering a sense of hopelessness and resignation in many. How starkly this contrasted with the life many had known or their parents had known on the land. Agricultural work was hard, undoubtedly, but it followed natural rhythms. There were periods of intense activity, like planting or harvest, but also quieter times. Tasks varied with the seasons, offering some change in physical demands. There was the sun on one's back, the feel of the earth, a connection to the living world that was entirely severed within the brick walls and artificial glare of the factory. The advent of gaslighting, and before it, the widespread use of candles and oil lamps, allowed the factory to defy the natural cycle of day and night. These artificial suns, though often flickering and casting eerie shadows, extended the workday far beyond the limits of daylight. The factory became a world unto itself, a brightly lit island of toil in the surrounding darkness, its windows glowing through the night, a constant reminder that the machines, and the people who served them, rarely rested. This detachment from the natural world was profound. Workers lived by the bell, the whistle, and the relentless rhythm of the machine, not by the position of the sun or the changing seasons. Their bodies, attuned over millennia to the cycles of nature, were now forced into an entirely artificial and demanding tempo. The sky, the stars, the very passage of natural time became distant concepts for those whose lives were almost entirely consumed within the factory's domain, their waking hours claimed by its insatiable appetite for labor. The sheer length of the working day, therefore, was more than just a measure of time. It was a fundamental characteristic of this new industrial life, a seemingly insurmountable barrier that consumed the workers' energy, health, and often their spirit. It left little space for family, for education, for leisure, or even for simple rest and recovery. This relentless demand on their time shaped every other aspect of their existence, particularly for the youngest and most vulnerable, whose childhoods were stolen by these crushing hours. Beyond the crushing length of the day, the factory environment itself was an unceasing, multifaceted assault on the senses, a stark negation of any remembered peace from a former life. Once the gates closed behind you, you were enveloped in a world entirely constructed for the purpose of production, a world that seemed to actively resist human comfort and quiet contemplation. The air, as we've noted, was often thick with dust and clinging fumes, the light dim and artificial, casting long, dancing shadows. But perhaps the most immediate and overwhelming sensation, the one that defined the very atmosphere of these industrial cathedrals, was the sound, a relentless, deafening, and inescapable barrage of mechanical noise that rarely, if ever, truly subsided. Imagine stepping from the relative quiet of a pre-dawn street, even a bustling one by former standards, into this enclosed, vibrating world. It wasn't a gradual increase in volume that one might acclimate to, but an instant immersion, a veritable wall of sound that hit you with an almost physical force, shaking the very air you breathed. This wasn't the distant, rhythmic clang of a village blacksmith's hammer or the gentle, predictable creak of a countryside watermill experienced from afar. This was the concentrated, amplified, and utterly bewildering clamor of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of powerful machines operating simultaneously within a confined space, each contributing its own strident voice to the overwhelming chorus of industry. In a textile mill, it was the thunderous, rhythmic clatter of power looms, thousands of wooden and metal shuttles flying back and forth with violent precision, the high-pitched, piercing whir of countless spinning frames drawing out fragile threads, the heavy percussive thump of carting engines aligning fibers. In an ironworks, the air quaked with the deafening roar of furnaces reducing ore to molten metal, the sharp explosive clang of steam hammers on glowing anvils, the jarring screech of metal being cut, ground, or forcibly shaped. Towering steam engines, the iron giants that powered so much of this relentless activity, added their own deep guttural beat, hissing clouds of hot steam and groaning pistons to the auditory chaos. This was not simply a loud environment, easily dismissed or adapted to. It was a living symphony of harsh, metallic, and often painfully discordant sounds, a tempest of noise. It was a relentless, percussive, grinding, shrieking, and roaring cacophony that vibrated upwards through the oil-soaked wooden floors, through the worn soles of your feet, and resonated deep within your very bones. A constant, unsettling tremor. There was no discernible melody, no rhythm that the human spirit could easily find solace or cadence in, only the raw, unyielding, and indifferent sound of power and mass production, a constant reminder of the immense, untamed forces at play all around you. The physical impact of this constant, inescapable sonic bombardment was undeniably severe and often led to lasting damage. Chronic, throbbing headaches were a common complaint, a dull ache that often persisted even after leaving the factory walls. Many workers, young and old, gradually developed partial or even complete deafness over time, the ceaseless roar effectively and permanently destroying the delicate mechanisms of the inner ear. Verbal communication, so vital for human connection and safety, was often reduced to desperate shouting mere inches from someone's ear, or more commonly to a crude but necessary system of hand signals and exaggerated lip reading, each exchange a frustrating effort. Psychologically, living and working for 12 to 16 hours a day within such an unceasing, inescapable din created a constant state of heightened tension, agitation, and profound weariness for many. There was no true peace to be found, no quiet corner to retreat to, even for a fleeting moment of mental respite. The human nervous system, designed for more varied and gentle stimuli, was perpetually overstimulated, frayed by the constant assault. For some, the noise became an invisible tormentor, a source of profound stress and deep-seated anxiety, grating on the mind as much as it physically assaulted the ears, an ever-present burden that shadowed their every waking moment. In such an oppressive environment, where the air trembled with mechanical fury and sound was a physical presence, one wonders about the worker's inner world. The volume drowned out subtlety. Could you think clearly? Could you hold a coherent thought, a daydream, a memory? Could you even hear yourself think above that unending roar? Or did the mind, for self-preservation, retreat into numbness or a jumble of half-formed thoughts, struggling to find a quiet space within itself amidst the external chaos that constantly threatened to invade and overwhelm any attempt at introspection or peace? And if the omnipresent noise was the inescapable, jarring soundtrack to daily factory life, the fundamental nature of the work itself provided its monotonous, soul-crushing rhythm. The tasks assigned to the vast majority of workers were meticulously designed for their simplicity and, most importantly, their endless, unvarying repetition. This was the very essence, the stark logic of the new industrial system. Breaking down previously complex craft processes which once demanded years of apprenticeship into a series of elementary, easily learned, and relentlessly repeatable actions. Each worker became responsible for one minuscule part of a larger unseen whole, performing the same restricted motion, the same tiny operation, hundreds if not thousands of times each grueling day. Imagine tending a spinning machine, your sole duty watching for and retying broken threads, hour after hour, fingers blurring, or feeding raw material into a stamping press, the same motion again and again, a lapse risking crushed fingers. Perhaps you were a piecer in a cotton mill, leaning to join yarns, back aching, or a filler in a coal mine, loading shuttle after shuttle. In a pin factory, one straightened wire, another cutted, a third sharpened points, each absorbed in a tiny fragment of creation, repeated endlessly until senses blurred and the mind sought any escape from the sheer tedium of the identical moment, lived over and over. This relentless, unyielding monotony, this constant repetition of identical, simple actions, had a profound and often detrimental effect on the mind. It systematically dulled the senses, actively discouraged any form of active, engaged thought, and frequently led to a state of profound mental fatigue that was almost hypnotic in its vacuity. There was precious little room, if any, for creativity, for independent problem-solving, or for the deep, intrinsic satisfaction that comes from seeing a complex product through from its inception to its completion. The work demanded a certain level of attention to avoid physical injury or costly error, but it rarely, if ever, engaged the higher, more reflective faculties of the human mind, leading instead to a pervasive sense of detachment, of simply numbly going through the motions. Unlike the artisan of the old order, who might dedicate years, even a lifetime, to honing a complex craft and thereby developing a wide and valuable range of skills, the factory worker often learned their specific, narrowly defined task within a few days or weeks, and then faced a future stretching out into a lifetime of mind-numbing repetition. There was seldom any opportunity for genuine advancement based on acquired skill or ingenuity, little chance to vary one's work or to learn new, more engaging aspects of the overall production process. The system was explicitly designed for the interchangeability of its human parts, not for the careful cultivation of individual mastery or unique talent. This inherent lack of intellectual stimulation and personal growth was another invisible, yet heavy, burden of the factory grind, slowly dimming the spark of curiosity. The workers' fundamental relationship with the tools of their labor had undergone a profound and disheartening transformation. No longer was the tool a familiar, responsive extension of the skilled human hand, guided by experience and insight. Now, all too often, the worker themselves became a mere extension of the vast, impersonal machine. Their every movement, their very posture was dictated by its relentless pace and its mechanical needs. Their attention held captive to its functions. The machine, whether powered by steam or water, was clearly the primary actor, the true protagonist in the production process. The human merely its tender, its feeder, its attendant, a living accessory to the unyielding iron and wood. This inversion of roles was a core element of the daily factory experience, deeply contributing to a pervasive sense of powerlessness and insignificance. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the factory floor, with its seemingly endless rows upon rows of identical, clattering machines, and the scores, sometimes hundreds of fellow workers performing similar, synchronized tasks, served only to reinforce this encroaching sense of being a small, almost anonymous part of a vast, impersonal, and utterly indifferent system. In the bustling, noisy, and often confusing enormity of it all, Individual identity and personal significance could easily feel diminished, even erased. You were but one among many, a face in the crowd, easily replaceable should you falter or complain. Your personal story, your hopes, and your aspirations seemingly irrelevant to the relentless, overarching drive for output that characterized the entire industrial enterprise. This debilitating feeling of being just another cog in the great grinding machine was amplified by the near-total lack of control that workers possessed over their immediate environment or the nature and pace of their labor. The speed of the churning machines, the exacting length of the working hours, the often hazardous conditions of the factory floor, the quality of the air they breathed, all these critical aspects of their daily existence were unilaterally determined by management, by unseen owners, by the abstract demands of profit. There was precious little scope for personal initiative, for suggesting improvements, or for influencing the way work was done. The worker was there to comply, to seamlessly fit into the preordained pattern. Their autonomy and agency effectively surrendered at the factory gate each bleak morning. In many fundamental and disturbing ways, this burgeoning industrial system treated human beings not as individuals with inherent worth, but as components, interchangeable, quantifiable, and ultimately expendable, much like the replaceable parts of the very machines they operate. Their precious energy, their finite time, their physical endurance, even their health, were increasingly viewed as mere commodities to be bought as cheaply as possible and utilized with maximum efficiency until exhausted. This insidious dehumanizing aspect, this cold reduction of a person to their sheer labor power, was perhaps one of the most grievous and insidious injuries inflicted by the early factory system, systematically stripping away dignity, self-respect, and individual worth in the relentless, single-minded pursuit of ever-increasing production and profit. The cumulative effect of the unceasing, deafening noise and the mind-numbing, repetitive grind was a profound deadening of the spirit for many. It created an inner landscape of exhaustion and sensory overload, a constant longing for silence, stillness, a reprieve from the machine's relentless demands. This daily experience, an assault on body and mind, shaped existence, fostering a weariness that transcended the physical. It cultivated a desperate yearning for the oblivion of sleep, that slice of death often the only accessible escape from the inescapable noise and unending grind, a temporary solace before the whistle shrieked anew, dragging them back to the cacophony and the toil. If the relentless hours eroded the spirit and the deafening noise assaulted the mind, then the very machines themselves posed a constant, visceral threat to the body. This, perhaps more than any other aspect, underscores why life as a factory worker during the Industrial Revolution truly sucked. For beyond the exhaustion and monotony lay the ever-present shadow of physical danger, a danger so commonplace it became a grimly accepted part of the job. It was the chilling possibility that a moment's inattention, a slip, or being in the wrong place at the wrong instant could lead to devastating injury. Safety, as we understand it with rigorous protocols, was an alien, almost fantastical concept in these early workshops. The early machines, marvels of cold iron and unforgiving wood, potent symbols of ingenuity, were rarely designed with human well-being in mind. Their purpose was production, relentless and efficient. Gears, often massive, were left entirely exposed, their teeth ready to bite, drive belts whirred menacingly without guards, and powerful presses stamped down with brutal force, often with no barriers to prevent a hand from straying too close. Imagine the visual chaos of these unguarded mechanisms, a constant dance of danger. The factory floor was a landscape of raw, moving parts, many operating at high speeds, an unforgiving environment where the human operator was often the most vulnerable component. Countless accidents stemmed from fast-moving belts, slapping leather straps, unguarded pulleys, and grinding geared wheels transmitting power. A loose piece of clothing, a stray strand of hair, or an unwary, fatigued hand could be snatched in one horrifying instant, drawing the worker silently into the unyielding mechanism. These systems, often in cramped, dimly lit spaces or running overhead, were like hidden traps, camouflaged by the gloom, waiting for the slightest misstep. The brutal power coursing through them meant that once caught, escape was often impossible without grievous damage, the machine utterly indifferent to human plight. Injuries to vulnerable hands and fingers were tragically common, almost a grim, unspoken expectation in some departments. Operating presses, looms with rapidly flying shuttles, or machines with intricate exposed parts meant fingers were constantly in perilous proximity to crushing, cutting, or shearing forces. A momentary lapse of concentration, a misjudgment of distance born of fatigue, could result in lost fingertips, mangled hands, or severed digits, a lifelong mark of their toil. For a worker whose livelihood and ability to perform basic daily tasks depended on manual dexterity, such an injury was a devastating blow, a constant, painful reminder Beyond finger loss, severe limb injuries were a horrifying reality. Arms could be caught by heavy rollers, twisted by drive shafts, or dragged into the hungry gears of a spinning mule. Legs might be crushed by falling components or mangled in the unseen underbelly of machinery. These were not minor incidents, they were catastrophic events, often resulting in permanent disability, crude, agonizing amputations with minimal antiseptic care, and a future where earning a living became an almost insurmountable challenge. The machinery, a testament to ingenuity, showed no mercy to its human attendants, leaving lives shattered in its wake. Multi-story factories with webs of overhead shafts and belts presented dangers from above and below. Tools or machine parts could work loose from vibrations and fall, striking workers. In cluttered, dimly lit, and oil-slick environments, trips and falls were common, sometimes into operating machinery or from unsecured platforms, rickety ladders, or open stairwells leading to broken bones or worse. Imagine the constant low-level anxiety, the need to be ever watchful not just of the machine before you, but of the environment around and above. Basic safety infrastructure like railings or tow boards was a rarity, a forgotten detail in the rush for production. While focusing on machinery, specific industries had unique perils, compounding mechanical risks. In ironworks, horrific burns from molten metal or intense furnace heat were a constant dread, the searing pain unforgettable. In pottery, fine clay dust led to potter's rot, a slow, suffocating decline. In textile mills processing cotton or flax, the air, thick with almost invisible fine dust, caused brown lung or other agonizing lung conditions. These ailments, unlike sudden mechanical trauma, crept up slowly, stealing breath and life by degrees, an insidious consequence of the environment, often as fatal as a swift, brutal accident. Consider young Thomas, perhaps 10, his small body weary from 10 hours tending a textile machine. His job, darting to repair broken threads, required nimble fingers and constant alertness. But in a moment of profound exhaustion, eyelids heavy, his attention wavered for a second. That second was enough for his small hand to be caught by the rapidly moving carriage. A thin scream, lost in the factory's din, a blur of motion, then the stark reality of crushed fingers. His working life, barely started, was potentially over or severely hampered, with scant comfort or skilled medical aid to follow, just the cold indifference of the system. Or picture Sarah, 17, working near a long, exposed spinning drive shaft powering looms. Her hair, a few strands escaped, or a loose thread from her worn shawl brushed the shaft. In less than a blink, it was caught. The powerful rotation gave no quarter, pulling her head and body violently towards the machinery. Her horrified cries, if she could utter them, were likely unheard or too late amidst the cacophony. The outcome, a severe, life-threatening scalping injury or worse, her body broken. A stark illustration of how everyday elements became sources of horrific trauma in this perilous, indifferent place. Then there was James, experienced but under constant pressure from the overseer to keep his machine running to meet the quota. When a jam occurred, stopping to wait for the millwright meant lost time and docked pay. So he took the risk, reaching into the still energized machine to clear the blockage. A sudden lurch, a gear engaging, and his arm was seized and mangled by the machine he was coaxing back to life. His attempt to save time, born of desperation and fear of reprisal, cost him dearly, a limb sacrificed to the relentless demands of production, a common story of impossible choices. These were not isolated incidents of bad luck, but common, predictable occurrences. A significant contributing factor was the sheer, bone-deep, unending exhaustion. After 12, 14, or 16 punishing hours of labor, often with insufficient food, human reflexes dulled, judgment became impaired, and the ability to maintain constant vigilance around dangerous machinery was severely compromised. Many terrible accidents occurred towards the end of long shifts when weary bodies and fogged minds simply could not keep up with the relentless demands of the machines or the punishing pace, a body's silent protest against its abuse. The pervasive gloom of many factory interiors also played its sinister part. Natural light was often insufficient, blocked by small, dirt-caked windows or the factory's sheer depth. Artificial lighting from flickering gas lamps or dim oil lights cast long, dancing, deceptive shadows, obscuring hazards and making it hard to judge distances or the speed of moving parts. The constant strain on the eyes was immense. In these poorly lit conditions, where shapes merged and depths were uncertain, a misplaced step or an unseen danger could easily lead to a terrible accident, the semi-darkness a constant, silent accomplice to injury. The relentless pressure to maintain production speed and meet demanding quotas often forced workers to take risks they might otherwise have avoided. Time spent on caution was viewed as time lost on output, clearing jams while machines were still powered, bypassing cumbersome safety procedures, if any existed. or working at a frantic pace were often implicitly or explicitly encouraged by overseers focused solely on numbers. Fear of fines or dismissal for slowness was a powerful motivator. This pervasive culture, prioritizing raw output above all human considerations, meant safety was a distant, secondary concern, leading to a tragic normalization of hazardous practices. For many entering the factories, especially those uprooted from rural life or the very young, there was little to no formal training in operating the complex, dangerous machinery safely. New workers, desperate for income, were often thrown into the fray, expected to learn by anxiously watching others or through harsh trial and error. This almost criminal lack of proper instruction, combined with the inherent dangers of poorly maintained equipment, created a perfect storm for accident. The most vulnerable and inexperienced workers, often children, thus became prime candidates for serious injury or worse, their innocence no shield against the peril. Perhaps the most damning aspect of this grim catalog of dangers was the pervasive, calculated indifference shown by many factory owners. Investing in safety guards, fencing off exposed machinery, or improving appalling lighting were often dismissed as unnecessary expenses that cut into profits. Production, and the wealth it generated for the few, was paramount. Accidents were too often callously viewed as the worker's own fault, a result of carelessness or incompetence, rather than an unavoidable consequence of the hazardous conditions owners knowingly created or perpetuated. Rare voices advocating for reform were often drowned out by the clamor for output. The human cost was rarely factored into the cold economic calculus of early industry. When accidents happened, maiming bodies and shattering lives, there was little recourse or support for the injured worker or their grieving family. Compensation from employers was minimal if it existed at all, certainly not a right. No reliable system of sick pay or disability benefits existed. Losing a limb or eyesight or suffering a debilitating injury meant not only agony but also the loss of one's livelihood, plunging the worker and dependents into deeper poverty. The factory, having taken their health, offered little but a grim reminder of their expendability. The cycle of poverty, deepened by injury, could haunt families for generations. Beyond the immediate, brutal dangers of unguarded machinery, another, more insidious enemy lurked within the factory walls. An enemy that workers unwillingly consumed with every breath they took. The air itself, the very medium of life, was often heavily contaminated, a far cry from the fresh breezes of the countryside many had left behind. This invisible assault on the lungs was yet another profound reason why it sucked to be a factory worker. A slow, creeping affliction that often led to chronic illness and a shortened, gasping existence for so many. In many industrial settings, particularly in the early, unregulated days, a thick, choking cloud hung in the air, a visible testament to the pollutants being spewed out by machines and processes. This haze was not merely an aesthetic unpleasantness, it was a complex cocktail of dusts, fibers, microscopic metallic particles, and chemical fumes. Workers moved through this miasma day after day, their lungs acting as reluctant filters for the refuse of industry, the particles settling deep within, beginning their damaging work silently, invisibly. Textile mills, especially those processing raw cotton, were notorious for their atmospheric conditions. The carding, spinning, and weaving processes released vast quantities of fine cotton dust, known as fly or white dust, into the air. This dust was so pervasive that it coated everything: machines, floors, windows, and most alarmingly, the workers themselves. They would leave their shifts covered in a fine white powder, a visible sign of the invisible particles they had inhaled throughout their long day, a constant, unwelcome companion. Breathing this cotton-laden air was an immediate source of irritation. Workers often described a persistent dryness in the throat, a constant tickle that provoked coughing, and a feeling of tightness in the chest, especially on Mondays or after any break from the mill environment. Their nasal passages would become clogged, and a bitter taste would linger. For those unaccustomed to it, the sensation could be overwhelming, a suffocating reminder of the unnatural environment they were forced to endure simply to earn their meager wage. Over time, this constant exposure to cotton dust led to a debilitating condition known grimly as byssinosis, or more colloquially, brown lung disease. It typically began with that Monday morning chest tightness and breathlessness, gradually worsening until the symptoms became persistent throughout the week. Eventually, it could progress to chronic bronchitis and emphysema, leaving sufferers permanently short of breath, their lung capacity severely diminished, their lives blighted by a constant struggle for air, a slow suffocation. Similar respiratory ailments afflicted workers in mills processing other vegetable fibers such as flax or hemp. While the specific nature of the dust differed, the outcome was often tragically similar. Terms like white lung disease or simply mill fever were used to describe the recurrent coughs, chest pains, and breathing difficulties experienced by those who toiled amidst these fibrous clouds. Each type of dust carried its own particular burden, its own way of scarring and inflaming the delicate tissues of the lungs, a hidden cost of textile production. Away from the textile mills, in the dark and dangerous confines of coal mines, another notorious dust reigned: coal dust. For miners, the air they breathed was thick with fine black particles, the result of hewing coal from the earth. Prolonged inhalation led to coal workers' pneumoconiosis, commonly known as black lung disease. This condition progressively scarred the lungs, reducing their ability to absorb oxygen, leading to chronic coughing, shortness of breath, and eventually severe disability or premature death. In the potteries, where clay was shaped and fired into plates, cups, and vases, workers faced the insidious threat of silica dust, the fine crystalline particles released during the handling of dry clay and the finishing of fired wares were easily inhaled. This led to silicosis, a devastating and irreversible lung disease sometimes called potter's asthma or potter's rot. The lungs would become progressively scarred and stiffened, making each breath a painful effort, another slow surrender to the dust of their trade. Workshops involved in metal grinding, polishing, or cutlery making were also filled with hazardous airborne particles. Tiny shards of metal and abrasive dust from grinding wheels would fill the air, lodging in workers' lungs. This could lead to various respiratory problems, including siderosis if iron dust was prevalent, or other forms of pneumoconiosis, contributing to chronic coughs, chest infections, and a gradual decline in lung function. The gleaming finish on the metal came at a hidden, painful price for those who created it. In dye works, where fabrics were transformed with vibrant colors, the air was often thick not just with steam but with noxious chemical fumes. Early synthetic dyes, and even some natural ones, involved a host of harsh chemicals: arsenic, chromium, and various volatile organic compounds. Workers, often laboring in poorly ventilated, steamy rooms, would inhale these fumes, leading to immediate issues like dizziness, nausea, and respiratory irritation, as well as longer-term damage to the lungs and other organs, the bright colors masking a toxic reality. Lead, a ubiquitous poison in the 19th century, presented another aerial threat in numerous industries. Painters inhaled lead from paint dust, pottery workers from lead glazes, typesetters from handling lead type in poorly ventilated print shops. Lead dust and fumes, when absorbed into the body, could cause a horrifying array of symptoms, including severe abdominal pain, nerve damage, anemia, and developmental problems, particularly in children. The lungs were a primary route for this poison to enter the system, a silent gateway to suffering. Beyond specific well-known toxins, a general miasma of other chemical irritants often permeated the factory air. Bleaching agents used in textile and paper production released chlorine or sulfur dioxide fumes, both highly damaging to respiratory tissues. Acids used for cleaning metal or other processes could create acrid mists. The cumulative effect of these various chemical exposures, even at low levels over long periods, contributed to a background of chronic respiratory inflammation and an increased susceptibility to infections for the beleaguered workforce. A common sound in many factories and in the cramped tenements where workers lived was the cough. It was a persistent, hacking, often painful cough, the mill cough, the miner's cough, the potter's cough, each industry lending its name to this shared symptom of distress. It was the body's desperate, often futile attempt to expel the foreign particles and irritants lodged deep within the airways. This cough became a constant companion for many, a soundtrack to their shortened lives, a badge of their hazardous occupation. Accompanying the cough was the pervasive sensation of difficulty breathing. Workers often described a feeling of a heavy weight on their chest, an inability to draw a full, satisfying breath. Wheezing, a whistling sound as air struggled to pass through narrowed airways, was common. Any physical exertion, even climbing a flight of stairs after a long shift, could leave them gasping, their damaged lungs unable to meet the body's demand for oxygen. This breathlessness was a constant reminder of their failing health, a creeping dread. The problem of airborne contaminants was massively compounded by a chronic lack of adequate ventilation in most factories. Windows were often kept deliberately closed, sometimes to maintain specific levels of humidity required for certain processes like cotton spinning or simply to keep out the cold in winter. There were no sophisticated air filtration systems. Stale, dust-laden, fume-filled air was simply recirculated, becoming ever more concentrated with pollutants as the long working day wore on, creating a truly toxic atmospheric soup. The diseases born from this poisoned air were often slow and insidious. Unlike a sudden, dramatic accident with machinery, these illnesses crept up on their victims over years, gradually robbing them of their strength and breath. Because the onset was gradual And because these conditions were so common, they were often met with a similar indifference from employers, as was shown to accident victims. A worker who could no longer keep pace due to a chronic cough or breathlessness was simply let go, their place taken by another, their slow decline a grim, unacknowledged sacrifice to industrial progress. Beyond the immediate, brutal dangers of unguarded machinery, another, more insidious enemy lurked within the factory walls, an enemy that workers unwillingly consumed with every breath they took. The air itself, the very medium of life, was often heavily contaminated, a far cry from the fresh breezes of the countryside many had left behind. This invisible assault on the lungs was yet another profound reason why it sucked to be a factory worker, a slow, creeping affliction that often led to chronic illness and a shortened, gasping existence for so many. In many industrial settings, particularly in the early, unregulated days, a thick, choking cloud hung in the air, a visible testament to the pollutants being spewed out by machines and processes. This haze was not merely an aesthetic unpleasantness, it was a complex cocktail of dusts, fibers, microscopic metallic particles, and chemical fumes. Workers moved through this miasma day after day, their lungs acting as reluctant filters for the refuse of industry, the particles settling deep within, beginning their damaging work silently, invisibly. Textile mills, especially those processing raw cotton, were notorious for their atmospheric conditions. The carding, spinning, and weaving processes released vast quantities of fine cotton dust, known as fly or white dust, into the air. This dust was so pervasive that it coated everything: machines, floors, windows, and most alarmingly, the workers themselves. They would leave their shifts covered in a fine white powder, a visible sign of the invisible particles they had inhaled throughout their long day, a constant, unwelcome companion. Breathing this cotton-laden air was an immediate source of irritation. Workers often described a persistent dryness in the throat, a constant tickle that provoked coughing, and a feeling of tightness in the chest, especially on Mondays or after any break from the mill environment. Their nasal passages would become clogged, and a bitter taste would linger. For those unaccustomed to it, the sensation could be overwhelming, a suffocating reminder of the unnatural environment they were forced to endure simply to earn their meager wage. Over time, this constant exposure to cotton dust led to a debilitating condition known grimly as abyssinosis, or more colloquially, brown lung disease. It typically began with that Monday morning chest tightness and breathlessness, gradually worsening until the symptoms became persistent throughout the week. Eventually, it could progress to chronic bronchitis and emphysema, leaving sufferers permanently short of breath, their lung capacity severely diminished, their lives blighted by a constant struggle for air, a slow suffocation. Similar respiratory ailments afflicted workers in mills processing other vegetable fibers such as flax or hemp. While the specific nature of the dust differed, the outcome was often tragically similar. Terms like white lung disease or simply mill fever were used to describe the recurrent coughs, chest pains, and breathing difficulties experienced by those who toiled amidst these fibrous clouds. Each type of dust carried its own particular burden, its own way of scarring and inflaming the delicate tissues of the lungs, a hidden cost of textile production. Away from the textile mills, in the dark and dangerous confines of coal mines, another notorious dust reigned: coal dust. For miners, the air they breathed was thick with fine black particles, the result of hewing coal from the earth. Prolonged inhalation led to coal workers' pneumoconiosis, commonly known as black lung disease. This condition progressively scarred the lungs, reducing their ability to absorb oxygen, leading to chronic coughing, shortness of breath, and eventually severe disability or premature death, the mine claiming its victims long after they left its depths. In the potteries, where clay was shaped and fired into plates, cups, and vases, workers faced the insidious threat of silica dust, the fine crystalline particles released during the handling of dry clay and the finishing of fired wares were easily inhaled. This led to silicosis, a devastating and irreversible lung disease sometimes called potter's asthma or potter's rot. The lungs would become progressively scarred and stiffened, making each breath a painful effort, another slow surrender to the dust of their trade. The workshops involved in metal grinding, polishing, or cutlery making were also filled with hazardous airborne particles. Tiny shards of metal and abrasive dust from grinding wheels would fill the air, lodging in workers' lungs. This could lead to various respiratory problems, including sidrosis if iron dust was prevalent, or other forms of pneumoconiosis, contributing to chronic coughs, chest infections, and a gradual decline in lung function. The gleaming finish on the metal came at a hidden, painful price for those who created it. In dye works, where fabrics were transformed with vibrant colors, the air was often thick not just with steam but with noxious chemical fumes, Early synthetic dyes, and even some natural ones, involved a host of harsh chemicals: arsenic, chromium, and various volatile organic compounds. Workers, often laboring in poorly ventilated, steamy rooms, would inhale these fumes, leading to immediate issues like dizziness, nausea, and respiratory irritation, as well as longer-term damage to the lungs and other organs, the bright colors masking a toxic reality. Lead, a ubiquitous poison in the 19th century, presented another aerial threat in numerous industries. Painters inhaled lead from paint dust, pottery workers from lead glazes, typesetters from handling lead type in poorly ventilated print shops. Lead dust and fumes, when absorbed into the body, could cause a horrifying array of symptoms, including severe abdominal pain, nerve damage, anemia, and developmental problems, particularly in children. The lungs were a primary route for this poison to enter the system, a silent gateway to suffering. Beyond specific well-known toxins, a general miasma of other chemical irritants often permeated the factory air. Bleaching agents used in textile and paper production released chlorine or sulfur dioxide fumes, both highly damaging to respiratory tissues. Acids, used for cleaning metal or other processes, could create acrid mists. The cumulative effect of these various chemical exposures, even at low levels over long periods, contributed to a background of chronic respiratory inflammation and an increased susceptibility to infections for the beleaguered workforce. A common sound in many factories and in the cramped tenements where workers lived was the cough. It was a persistent, hacking, often painful cough. The mill cough, the miner's cough, the potter's cough, each industry lending its name to this shared symptom of distress. It was the body's desperate, often futile attempt to expel the foreign particles and irritants lodged deep within the airways. This cough became a constant companion for many, a soundtrack to their shortened lives, a badge of their hazardous occupation. Accompanying the cough was the pervasive sensation of difficulty breathing. Workers often described a feeling of a heavy weight on their chest, an inability to draw a full, satisfying breath. Wheezing, a whistling sound as air struggled to pass through narrowed airways, was common. Any physical exertion, even climbing a flight of stairs after a long shift, could leave them gasping, their damaged lungs unable to meet the body's demand for oxygen. This breathlessness was a constant reminder of their failing health, a creeping dread. The problem of airborne contaminants was massively compounded by a chronic lack of adequate ventilation in most factories. Windows were often kept deliberately closed, sometimes to maintain specific levels of humidity required for certain processes like cotton spinning, or simply to keep out the cold in winter. There were no sophisticated air filtration systems. Stale, dust-laden, fume-filled air was simply recirculated, becoming ever more concentrated with pollutants as the long working day wore on, creating a truly toxic atmospheric soup. The diseases born from this poisoned air were often slow and insidious. Unlike a sudden, dramatic accident with machinery, these illnesses crept up on their victims over years, gradually robbing them of their strength and breath. Because the onset was gradual and because these conditions were so common, they were often met with a similar indifference from employers as was shown to accident victims. A worker who could no longer keep pace due to a chronic cough or breathlessness was simply let go, their place taken by another, their slow decline a grim, unacknowledged sacrifice to industrial progress. Beyond the inherent dangers of the machinery and the pervasive threat of a poisoned atmosphere, the life of a factory worker was further constrained by a rigid, unyielding system of discipline. If the machines dictated the pace of labor, then the rules and regulations, enforced with unwavering severity, governed every other aspect of their waking hours within those formidable walls. This was not a place of gentle guidance or mutual respect, but one where order was imposed from above, designed to extract maximum effort and ensure complete compliance, often crushing the human spirit in the process. From the perspective of the factory owner, this strict discipline was a necessity. The new machinery, expensive and complex, needed to be operated continuously and efficiently to justify its cost. A workforce accustomed to the more flexible, self-directed rhythms of agricultural or artisanal labor had to be molded into a synchronized, almost mechanical unit. The factory system demanded a new kind of worker: punctual, obedient, and tirelessly attentive. Thus, an elaborate and often harsh code of conduct was devised to shape human behavior to the unyielding demands of the machine. Central to this new discipline was the tyranny of the factory clock. Punctuality was not merely encouraged, it was ruthlessly enforced. The factory gates were often locked precisely at the appointed starting time, and even a few minutes of lateness could result in a hefty fine, a significant portion of a day's meager wages, or even being locked out for the entire shift, meaning no pay at all. Workers, many of whom had no reliable clocks at home, lived in constant anxiety of missing the shrill blast of the factory whistle that summoned them to their toil. Once inside, the rules often extended to controlling even the most basic forms of human interaction. In many factories, talking amongst workers was strictly forbidden or severely limited. Whistling, singing, or any sound deemed distracting from the task at hand could incur a penalty. The ideal was a silent, focused workforce, each individual isolated in their labor, their attention solely on the machine before them. This enforced silence contributed to the dehumanizing atmosphere, suppressing the natural human need for connection and camaraderie during long hours of shared effort. Equally stringent were the rules regarding attention. Workers were expected to maintain unwavering focus on their machines and their specific tasks. Looking out of a window, allowing one's gaze to wander, or any perceived sign of daydreaming or inattentiveness could bring swift reprimand or punishment from the ever-watchful overseer. The demand was for constant, unblinking vigilance, a level of concentration that was incredibly difficult to sustain over 12 or 14 hours of repetitive, mind-numbing labor, especially when coupled with chronic fatigue. Movement within the factory was also tightly controlled. Workers were often assigned a specific station and forbidden to leave it without explicit permission from the overseer. This applied even to basic human needs like getting a drink of water or using the often rudimentary and unsanitary toilet facilities. Such requests could be denied or delayed, forcing workers to endure discomfort or risk fines for leaving their post. This restriction on physical movement further emphasized the workers' subservience to the demands of production and the authority of their superiors. One of the most pervasive methods of enforcing these myriad rules was through a comprehensive system of fines. These deductions from already pitifully low wages were levied for a vast array of minor infractions, keeping many workers in a state of perpetual debt or barely able to make ends meet. The list of finable offenses was often long and arbitrary, posted for all to see, yet subject to the overseer's interpretation. This system was a powerful tool of control, as the threat of losing precious earnings loomed large over every worker. What could a worker be fined for? The list was extensive, arriving a few minutes late, as mentioned, but also for imperfections in their work, no matter how small. A spot of oil on the finished cloth, a slightly misaligned component, a dropped tool. All could result in a financial penalty. Even the state of their workstation could be grounds for a fine. A dirty machine or a floor not swept to the overseer's satisfaction might see wages docked. The fines often seemed disproportionate to the alleged offense, a constant siphoning of income. Fines could also be imposed for actions stemming from basic human needs or minor lapses, taking an unauthorized drink of water, or being caught eating a piece of bread at one's station, sneezing too loudly, or even the accidental breakage of a needle or a minor part of the machine could lead to deductions. In some mills, children were fined for being too slow, for an inability to keep up with the relentless pace, or for showing visible signs of fatigue. These fines underscored the harshness of a system that prioritized profit over basic human dignity. When fines were deemed insufficient, or particularly for younger workers who had little to lose financially, factory discipline often escalated to direct physical punishment. This was especially prevalent where children and women formed a large part of the workforce, as they were considered easier to intimidate and control through such brutal means. Overseers, armed with straps or canes and imbued with almost unchecked authority, would patrol the factory floors, ready to dispense instant, painful retribution for any perceived infraction, real or imagined. Strapping or belting was a common form of physical chastisement, particularly for child laborers. A thick leather strap, sometimes with a weighted end, would be used to strike children across their backs, hands, or legs. This was often done to rouse them from exhaustion-induced drowsiness, to punish them for mistakes, or simply to terrify them into working faster. The pain and humiliation of these beatings were a constant feature of life for many young factory hands, a cruel method of enforcing discipline on small, tired bodies. Beyond strapping, other forms of direct physical violence were not uncommon. Overseers might resort to hitting workers with their fists, boxing their ears, which could cause permanent hearing damage, or kicking them. Children, being smaller and more vulnerable, were easy targets. Stories abound of youngsters being dragged from under machines where they had fallen asleep and brutally beaten, or having their heads pushed into water cisterns for being slow. Such acts created an atmosphere of fear and terror, ensuring compliance through brute force. These punishments, whether fines or physical abuse, were often carried out publicly, in full view of other workers. This served a dual purpose, to chastise the individual offender and to serve as a chilling warning to everyone else. The humiliation of being fined for a triviality, or the terror of witnessing a fellow worker, especially a child, being beaten, reinforced the power structure and discouraged any collective dissent or challenge to the overseer's authority. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain control over a large and often desperate workforce. This entire system of strict rules and harsh punishments was built upon a profound and almost absolute power imbalance. The factory owner and their appointed overseers held all the cards. Workers, especially in times of high unemployment, had virtually no leverage. Complaining about conditions, questioning a fine, or resisting punishment could, and often did, lead to instant dismissal. With no unions to protect them and no social safety net to fall back on, the individual worker stood alone and vulnerable against the might of the factory system. This power dynamic was further entrenched by the view that individual workers were largely expendable. In the burgeoning industrial towns, there was often a ready supply of desperate people willing to take any job under almost any conditions. An injured worker, a troublemaker who questioned authority, or someone simply deemed too slow or inefficient could be easily replaced. This knowledge hung heavy in the air, a constant unspoken threat that compelled most to endure the harsh discipline in silence, their anger and resentment simmering beneath a veneer of obedience. So within these brick walls, under the relentless gaze of the clock and the overseer, subject to a bewildering array of rules and the constant threat of punishment, what space remained for the human spirit? When your time, your speech, your very movements were so tightly controlled, your small earnings perpetually at risk from arbitrary fines, your body subject to physical blows for the slightest error or sign of weariness, one must surely ask, what little freedom did you have left? It was a system designed to grind down individuality, to mold humans into tireless, uncomplaining extensions of the machinery they served. Among the myriad hardships endured by the working classes during the Industrial Revolution, none casts a darker or more enduring shadow than the widespread exploitation of children. If adult life in the factories and mines was a grim struggle for survival, for countless young souls, it was an almost unimaginable ordeal, a theft of innocence and health on an industrial scale. Their story is a particularly heart-wrenching chapter in why it truly sucked to be a part of this new laboring world, a testament to an era that often valued profit far above humanity, especially for its most vulnerable. Picture, if you will, these tiny figures, lost in the shadow of giants, not just the towering machinery that surrounded them, but also the immense, unyielding economic forces that had drawn them into the vortex of industrial labor. Children as young as 5 or 6, sometimes even younger, were commonplace sights in the mills, mines, and manufactories. Their small hands and bodies were put to work for the same crushing hours as adults, their childhood years spent not in play or learning, but in relentless, often perilous, toil, their futures mortgaged before they had truly begun. One of the primary and most cynical reasons for the extensive employment of children was brutally simple: they were cheap. Factory and mine owners could pay children a mere fraction of what an adult worker would earn, sometimes as little as 10 to 20%. For businesses driven by the pursuit of maximum profit, this represented an irresistible economic advantage. Children's labor helped to keep production costs down and profits high, their tiny wages a stark reflection of their perceived worth in this new industrial calculus. Their small stature was another key factor. Children with their nimble fingers and slight frames could perform tasks that were difficult or impossible for adults. They could crawl into confined spaces, reach into the intricate workings of complex machinery to clear jams or retrieve fallen materials, and navigate narrow passages in mines. This perceived advantage of their size often placed them in situations of extreme danger, working in close proximity to moving parts or in structurally unsound areas, their smallness making them both useful and exceptionally vulnerable. Furthermore, children were often seen by employers as more docile, obedient, and less likely to cause trouble than adult workers. They were considered easier to discipline, more susceptible to threats and intimidation, and less likely to organize or protest against their appalling conditions. Overseers could enforce rules and maintain a high pace of work through fear, knowing that these young workers had little power to resist. This perceived manageability made them an attractive and easily exploited component of the labor force for many employers. It is crucial to understand that children were not typically sent to work by unfeeling parents, but out of sheer, desperate family poverty. When adult wages were so low that they could not support a household, even with both parents working, the tiny earnings of a child, however meager, could mean the difference between starvation and survival. Families faced agonizing choices, and the necessity of sending their children into the factories or mines was often a heartbreaking testament to their struggle to simply stay alive in a harsh and unforgiving economic system. In the bustling, noisy textile mills, one of the most common jobs for children was that of a piecer. Their task was to watch the spinning frames and, when a thread broke, to quickly lean into the machinery, often while it was still in motion, and re-tie the broken ends. This required them to crawl under the machines, amidst the moving parts and falling dust, for hours on end. A moment's hesitation or a clumsy movement could result in serious injury, their small hands and arms easily caught by the relentless mechanisms they served. Even more dangerous was the job of a scavenger. These were usually the smallest children, tasked with crawling completely beneath the massive, operating spinning mules to retrieve fallen tufts of cotton or waste. They had to time their movements precisely, darting in and out between the cyclical advance and retreat of the heavy carriage. If they mistimed it, if they were too slow, or if they simply stumbled in the dark, cramped space, they could be crushed or horribly maimed. It was a terrifying, high-stakes gamble repeated countless times a day. Deep underground, in the Stygian darkness of the coal mines, children endured equally horrific conditions. Some of the youngest, known as trappers, would sit alone in the pitch black for up to 12 hours a day, their sole responsibility to open and close wooden ventilation doors, or traps, to allow the coal wagons, or corves, to pass through. They sat in silence, often in damp, cold conditions, the darkness broken only by the occasional candle of a passing miner, their young minds left to conjure fears in the oppressive solitude, a lonely vigil. Older children in the mines, both boys and girls, often worked as hurriers or drawers. This involved the back-breaking labor of pulling or pushing heavy tubs filled with coal along narrow, low-roofed tunnels from the coal face to the main haulage ways or the pit bottom. Sometimes they were harnessed like animals with a girdle and chain, crawling on their hands and knees in wet, muddy conditions, dragging immense weights for hours on end. The physical strain was immense, their young bodies contorted and overworked. Beyond textiles and coal, children were exploited in numerous other industries. In match factories, young girls dipped matchsticks into white phosphorus, leading to the horrifying phossy jaw, a condition where the jawbone decayed. In nail-making workshops, children hammered out nails in hot, dirty conditions. In potteries, they carried heavy loads of clay or worked in rooms filled with lead glaze dust. In glass factories, they endured intense heat. Almost every corner of the burgeoning industrial world found a way to utilize and often abuse child labor. This physical toll of such premature and arduous labor on young, developing bodies was devastating and often irreversible. Stunted growth was rampant. Children who spent their formative years toiling for long hours in cramped positions, performing heavy tasks, and subsisting on inadequate diets often failed to reach their full potential height or physical development. Their bodies, starved of proper nutrition and rest and subjected to unrelenting strain, simply could not grow as they should have, a visible mark of their harsh upbringing. Deformities were another tragic consequence. The unnatural postures demanded by their work, constant stooping in low mine tunnels, hours spent leaning over machines or carrying heavy loads, led to bent spines, curved backs, and twisted limbs. Bowed legs, swollen and painful joints, and malformed pelvises, particularly in girls who had worked as hurriers, were common afflictions. These physical distortions were not just cosmetic, they often caused chronic pain and limited mobility for the rest of their shortened lives. Weakened by overwork and malnutrition, these child laborers were far more susceptible to the diseases that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of factories and crowded urban slums. Respiratory illnesses from dusty environments, infectious diseases like tuberculosis, and the ever-present risk of horrific accidents with machinery took a disproportionate toll on their fragile lives. Their childhood was a gauntlet of hazards with sickness and injury lurking around every corner, their small bodies ill-equipped to fight back. Beyond the appalling physical cost, child labor represented a profound theft of childhood itself. There was no time or energy for play, for laughter, for the simple joys and explorations that should define one's early years. The factory or the mine became their entire world, a bleak landscape of toil and exhaustion. Education was an unattainable dream for most. Days that should have been spent in a classroom learning to read and write were instead consumed by the monotonous, grueling demands of adult work, leaving them trapped in a cycle of illiteracy. And the lack of education had lifelong consequences, limiting their future opportunities and often perpetuating poverty into the next generation. But perhaps the greatest loss was the irretrievable one, the loss of childhood itself, that precious, fleeting period of growth, discovery, and carefree existence. These tiny figures, forced to become miniature adults, carried the burdens of a working life long before their minds or bodies were ready. Their stolen youth remains one of the most shameful legacies of the early Industrial Revolution, a quiet sorrow woven into the fabric of its progress. When the long, deafening, and dangerous shift at the factory finally ended, the worker, bone-weary and coated in grime, did not step out into a world of comfort or reprieve. Instead, the brief journey from the factory gates often led them into another kind of oppressive environment. the overcrowded, squalid slums that festered in the heart of these new industrial cities. The struggle for survival did not cease with the factory whistle. It merely changed its form, its location, its particular brand of misery that clung to them even in their supposed place of rest. These sprawling slums were a direct consequence of the Industrial Revolution's insatiable demand for labor, which drew vast populations from the countryside into urban centers. Towns exploded into cities with a speed that far outpaced any attempt at planning or provision of basic amenities. Speculative builders threw up cheap, inadequate housing as quickly as possible, cramming as many structures as they could into any available space, with little thought for the health or well-being of those who would inhabit them. The result was a chaotic, unhealthy urban landscape. The most striking feature of these districts was the sheer density of human life. Streets, or more accurately narrow alleys and unpaved courts, teemed with people. Buildings were packed so tightly together that sunlight and fresh air struggled to penetrate the lower levels. Every available inch of land seemed to be occupied, creating a claustrophobic environment where the sights, sounds, and smells of thousands of closely packed lives were inescapable, a constant assault on the senses even outside the factory. Within these poorly constructed buildings, overcrowding reached extreme levels. It was not uncommon for a single small room, perhaps no more than 10 or 12 feet square, to be the sole dwelling place for an entire family. Sometimes 2 or even 3 families would share such a space, their meager belongings crammed together, with only a chalk line on the floor or a ragged curtain to delineate their separate homes. Privacy was an unimaginable luxury in these conditions. Imagine the constant, unavoidable presence of others, the noise of neighbors through thin walls, the cries of infants, the arguments, the coughing. There was no personal space, no quiet corner to retreat to after a grueling day. Sleep itself was often disturbed by the sheer proximity of so many bodies in a confined area. This relentless lack of privacy and peace added another layer of stress to lives already burdened by hard labor and poverty, making true rest an elusive dream. The dwellings themselves were often shoddily built, using the cheapest available materials. Walls were thin and damp, roofs leaked, and floors, if not bare earth, were often of rotting wood. These structures offered little protection against the cold of winter or the dampness that seemed to pervade everything. Dilapidation and decay were the norm, with crumbling plaster, broken windows stuffed with rags, and a pervasive sense of neglect that mirrored the conditions within the factories themselves. Natural light and fresh air, essential for health and well-being, were scarce commodities in these slums. Windows, if they existed, were often small, sealed shut, or broken and boarded up. Many houses were built back to back, meaning there was no possibility of through ventilation. The air within these rooms would become thick and stagnant, heavy with the smells of unwashed bodies, cooking fumes, and sickness. This lack of ventilation created a perfect breeding ground for airborne diseases. Perhaps the worst accommodations were the cellar dwellings. These were underground rooms, often damp, dark, and entirely without ventilation or natural light, save for what might filter down from a street-level grating. Families lived in these subterranean spaces, sometimes with several inches of fetid water on the floor. The air was foul, the conditions unimaginably grim. Yet even these miserable holes commanded rent from those who had no other option, a truly desperate form of shelter. Sanitation facilities were grossly inadequate if they existed at all. A common arrangement was a shared privy or outdoor toilet for an entire court or street, sometimes serving dozens or even hundreds of people. These privies were often little more than a hole in the ground with a flimsy shelter, rarely emptied and frequently overflowing. The stench was overpowering, and the proximity of human waste to dwellings was a major source of disease, a constant, unavoidable hazard. Proper sewage systems were largely absent in these rapidly developed areas. Household wastewater, and often the overflow from privies, would run through open drains or shallow channels in the streets and alleys, if it drained at all. Often it would stagnate, forming foul-smelling pools. In many places, cesspools were dug near houses, which frequently leaked, contaminating the surrounding soil and any nearby water sources. The ground itself was often saturated with filth. Access to clean water was another critical problem. Water for drinking, cooking, and washing was often drawn from communal standpipes or wells that were easily contaminated by the overflowing privies and leaking cesspools. Sometimes the only source was a nearby river or canal, already heavily polluted by industrial effluent and human waste. This tainted water was a primary vector for the spread of deadly diseases ingested daily by an unknowing population. The streets and courtyards of the slums were rarely cleaned. Household refuse, animal dung, and all manner of filth accumulated in festering heaps, attracting rats and other vermin. There was no organized system for waste collection in many of these poorer districts. This decomposing matter added to the general squalor and the pervasive, unhealthy miasma that hung over these neighborhoods, a constant reminder of the public health crisis unfolding within them. It is no surprise, then, that these overcrowded and unsanitary conditions created a perfect breeding ground for disease. Malnourished and exhausted from their factory work, residents of the slums had weakened immune systems, making them highly susceptible to the infectious illnesses that spread like wildfire through these densely packed communities. Epidemics were frequent and devastating, often carrying off large numbers of the population, particularly the very young and the elderly. Cholera was one of the most feared diseases of the era. It could strike with terrifying speed, causing severe diarrhea and dehydration, often leading to death within hours if untreated. Spread primarily through water contaminated with human waste, cholera epidemics swept through the slums with devastating effect, leaving panic and bereavement in their wake. The link to sanitation was not always understood initially, making it an even more terrifying and seemingly random killer. Tuberculosis, often called consumption due to the way it seemed to waste away its victims, was another rampant killer. This airborne disease thrived in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated living conditions of the slums. A persistent cough, fever, weight loss, and night sweats were its hallmarks. It spread easily from person to person through coughing and sneezing in close quarters, making entire families and neighborhoods vulnerable. For many, a diagnosis of consumption was a slow death sentence. Typhoid fever, like cholera, was often spread through contaminated water or food, and it too exacted a heavy toll, with symptoms including high fever, headaches, and abdominal pain. Beyond these major epidemic diseases, a host of other ailments plagued the slum dwellers: dysentery, measles, scarlet fever, influenza, and various skin infections. Infant and child mortality rates in these areas were appallingly high, a tragic testament to the deadly environment they were born into. The home environment, therefore, far from being a sanctuary, often presented its own set of dangers and discomforts, offering little true rest or recuperation from the arduous factory labor. The brief hours spent away from the deafening machines and watchful overseers were passed in conditions that further drained their energy and undermined their health. It was a relentless cycle of exhaustion, where both work and home contributed to a shortened and miserable existence. So, after enduring 12, 14, or even 16 hours of grinding toil in the factory, surviving the dangerous machinery, the polluted air, and the harsh discipline, the worker returned to a home that was itself a battleground against disease, filth, and despair. In such a world, where both the place of work and the place of dwelling seemed designed to break the body and spirit, one must truly ponder, after surviving the factory, could you even find rest at home? After enduring the perils of the factory and the squalor of their living quarters, the factory worker faced yet another relentless daily battle: the struggle for adequate sustenance. The fuel required to power their bodies through punishingly long shifts was often scarce, of poor quality, and obtained with great difficulty. Food, that most basic human necessity, became another stark indicator of their harsh existence, another reason why it truly sucked to be a worker in these transformative yet brutal times. Sustaining life itself was a constant, wearying challenge. The meager wages earned through exhausting labor dictated every aspect of their diet. With barely enough to cover rent for their cramped lodgings, there was precious little left for food. Every purchasing decision was a careful calculation, a desperate attempt to stretch insufficient pennies to feed hungry mouths. This economic reality meant that the diet of a typical factory worker and their family was, by necessity, monotonous, limited, and often severely lacking in the vital nutrients needed for health and strength. The cornerstone of this impoverished diet was almost invariably bread. It was cheap, relatively filling, and readily available. However, the quality was often dubious. Loaves could be coarse, heavy, and sometimes made from inferior or adulterated flour. Stale bread was common, sold at a slight discount to those who could afford nothing better. For many, bread in various forms constituted the bulk of their caloric intake, a bland but essential foundation to their daily meals. Potatoes were another mainstay, particularly in certain regions or when grain prices were high. Like bread, they were cheap and could fill an empty stomach. Boiled or occasionally roasted if a fire was available, potatoes offered some nutritional value, but a diet heavily reliant on them alone was far from balanced. Their monotonous presence on the dinner table day after day was a testament to the limited choices available to the working poor, a starchy bulwark against outright starvation. For breakfast, or perhaps a meager supper, watery gruel or porridge was common, often made from oats or other cheap grains and thinned extensively with water to make it go further. This provided some warmth and a temporary feeling of fullness. Milk, if added at all, would be a scant amount, and sugar, a rare luxury. This simple, often tasteless concoction was a staple for starting the day, or ending it, on an empty promise of nourishment. Meat, a significant source of protein and iron, was a luxury seldom afforded by the average factory worker. If it appeared on the table at all, it was likely to be a very small piece of the cheapest cuts. such as fatty bacon, offal like liver or tripe, or scraps sold off by butchers at the end of the day. Fresh, good quality meat was largely out of reach. This scarcity contributed significantly to the poor health and lack of stamina experienced by many workers. Vegetables, when available and affordable, usually consisted of the hardiest and cheapest varieties: onions, turnips, cabbages, or perhaps some carrots. These were often boiled for long periods, sometimes with a scrap of bacon for flavor if the family was fortunate, a process that diminished their already limited nutritional content. Fresh, green vegetables or fruits rich in vitamins were rarities, beyond the budget of most working families struggling in the urban landscape. Every penny counted in the daily struggle for food, and this desperation made the working poor particularly vulnerable to another pervasive evil, the adulteration of foodstuffs. Unscrupulous traders and shopkeepers frequently tampered with their goods to increase profits, selling items that were not only of poor quality but sometimes actively harmful. This was especially true for staples like bread, where every penny counted, often for bread that wasn't quite right. Bread, the staff of life, was commonly adulterated in a shocking number of ways. Alum was often added to flour to make bread whiter and appear more appealing, or to allow bakers to use cheaper, lower-grade flour. Chalk, plaster of Paris, or even sawdust could be mixed in to increase the weight of loaves, cheating customers who paid by the pound. These additions not only offered no nutritional value, but could also cause serious digestive problems and other health issues. Other essential foodstuffs suffered a similar fate. Tea, a popular beverage, was frequently bulked out with re-dried used tea leaves, or with the leaves of other plants like sloe or ash, and sometimes colored with dubious substances like black lead. Milk was commonly diluted with water, often drawn from questionable sources, and then whitened with chalk or other powders to hide its thinness. Such deceptions were rampant, making it difficult for workers to obtain even basic, honest nourishment. In the sprawling, unsanitary urban slums, obtaining fresh, wholesome food was a constant challenge. Proper markets with fresh produce were often distant or too expensive. Local small shops or street vendors might sell goods that were already old, of inferior quality, or on the verge of spoiling. The lack of proper food storage in their cramped, often damp homes also meant that any food purchased could quickly deteriorate, adding to the risk of illness from contaminated provisions. This monotonous, poor quality, and often adulterated diet was chronically deficient in many essential vitamins and minerals. While the science of nutrition was still in its infancy, the physical effects of these deficiencies were plain to see. Scurvy, though less common than on long sea voyages, could still occur. More widespread were general symptoms of malnutrition, weakness, lethargy, poor eyesight, and a host of other ailments stemming from a body starved of what it truly needed. Many factory workers lived in a state of perpetual hunger, their caloric intake insufficient for the heavy labor they performed. Others might consume enough bulk in the form of bread and potatoes to feel physically full, yet remain profoundly unnourished, their bodies craving the missing vitamins, minerals, and proteins. This state of being full, yet underfed, contributed to poor health, a lack of vitality, and a diminished capacity to resist disease or recover from injury. The direct impact on energy levels was significant. Attempting to endure 12 to 14 hours of physically demanding factory work on such an inadequate diet was a recipe for chronic fatigue. Workers often described feeling drained, lacking the strength and stamina their jobs required. This lack of energy not only made the work itself more arduous, but also increased the risk of accidents, as tired bodies and minds were less able to cope with dangerous machinery. A consistently poor diet inevitably led to weakened immune systems. Malnourished individuals were far more susceptible to the infectious diseases that rampaged through the slums and factories: tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, influenza, and countless others. Their bodies simply lacked the reserves and the strength to fight off these invaders. Good nutrition is a cornerstone of health, and its absence left the working class dangerously vulnerable to the many illnesses of the age. For children, the consequences of malnutrition were particularly devastating and long-laddering. Stunted physical growth was common. Their small bodies denied the building blocks needed for proper development. Rickets, a bone disease caused by a lack of vitamin D and calcium, led to bowed legs and other skeletal deformities, a visible legacy of their deprived upbringing. Malnourished children were also more prone to illness and had higher mortality rates, their already harsh lives made even more precarious by the lack of good food. In some industrial areas, particularly in more isolated mining communities, workers were compelled to buy their food and other necessities from company-owned stores, often as part of a truck system. Goods in these stores were frequently overpriced and of inferior quality, and workers paid through deductions from their wages, often finding themselves in perpetual debt to their employers. This system further limited their choices and control over the food they could obtain for their families. The constant anxiety about food, where the next meal would come from, whether it would be enough, whether it was even safe to eat, cast a long shadow over family life. It was the source of daily worry and stress, contributing to the grim atmosphere of their existence. For parents, the inability to adequately feed their children was a source of profound anguish. This fundamental struggle for basic nourishment was a defining feature of why life as a factory worker and for their families so profoundly sucked. While life in the factories on the surface was a relentless grind fraught with peril, there existed another realm of labor, hidden from the daylight, that plunged workers into even deeper, more terrifying extremes of hardship. We speak now of the coal mines, those dark arteries burrowed into the earth, which fueled the fires of industry but often became tombs for those who toiled within them. The story of the coal miner is a particularly stark illustration of why it sucked to be a worker in this era of relentless progress. Deep beneath the earth, where the sun never reached, men, women, and children descended each day into a world utterly alien to surface dwellers. This subterranean kingdom was one of perpetual night, oppressive silence broken only by the ring of pickaxes or the rumble of coal wagons, and the constant, unnerving presence of the earth's immense weight above. It was a place that demanded extraordinary endurance and bravery, yet offered little in return but meager wages and the ever-present threat of a sudden, violent end, or a slow, gasping decline. The darkness in these early mines was profound, almost absolute. The only illumination came from flickering candles or small, smoky oil lamps carried by the miners, or sometimes affixed to their caps. These feeble lights cast long, dancing shadows, making it difficult to discern hazards or judge distances accurately. The gloom was a constant companion, contributing to a sense of isolation and disorientation, and adding an extra layer of psychological strain to the already physically demanding work. A world seen only in fragments of unsteady light. Dampness was another pervasive feature of the underground environment. Water constantly seeped through the rock strata, dripping from roofs and walls, creating muddy, slippery floors. In many mines, workers toiled for hours in standing water, sometimes knee-deep or even waist-deep, in poorly drained sections. This constant exposure to cold and wet conditions led to rheumatism, chills, and other ailments, adding to their daily misery and weakening their resistance to more serious diseases that festered in the damp. The passages and coal seams themselves were often incredibly cramped. To save on the effort of excavating rock, tunnels were kept as narrow and low as possible. Adult miners often had to work in contorted, stooped positions, or even lying on their sides, for hours on end, wielding their picks and shovels in spaces sometimes no more than 2 or 3 feet high. This unnatural posture inflicted a terrible toll on their bodies over time, leading to chronic back pain and skeletal deformities. Ventilation in these early mines was rudimentary at best, relying on natural drafts or, in some cases, fires lit at the bottom of a second shaft to create an updraft. The air underground was often stale, heavy, and deficient in oxygen. Worse still, it could become thick with dangerous gases seeping from the coal seams. Methane, known as fire damp, was a constant invisible threat, while choke damp, or black damp, carbon dioxide or nitrogen, could silently asphyxiate unsuspecting workers in poorly ventilated areas. The ever-present risk of roof collapses or cave-ins haunted every miner. The wooden props used to support the roofs of tunnels and excavated areas were often inadequate, hastily placed, or weakened by dampness and pressure. Without warning, tons of rock and earth could come crashing down, burying workers alive or crushing them instantly. The unsettling creaks and groans of the shifting earth overhead were a constant, terrifying reminder of the thin margin between life and entombment in the deep. Fire damp, primarily methane, was the most feared of the explosive gases. Odorless, colorless, and lighter than air, it would accumulate in pockets near the roof or in unventilated sections of the mine. A naked flame from a miner's candle or lamp, the only source of light available, could ignite it with catastrophic results. Miners often spoke of the air singing, or their lamps burning with an unusual blue halo as a warning sign of its presence, a prelude to potential disaster. When fire damp ignited, the result was a devastating explosion. A sudden, searing blast of flame would rip through the tunnels, accompanied by a concussive force that could kill instantly, hurl bodies and equipment through the air, and trigger massive roof collapses. The intense heat could cause horrific burns. These explosions were terrifyingly common, often claiming dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives in a single horrific event, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable destruction and sorrow on the surface. Even for those who survived the initial blast of a fire damp explosion, another deadly threat often followed: afterdamp. This was a toxic cocktail of gases, primarily carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, produced by the explosion. Odorless and invisible, it would silently fill the devastated tunnels, suffocating rescuers and any miners who had survived the flames and forge. Often, more lives were lost to afterdamp than to the explosion itself, a quiet, creeping death in the darkness. Astonishingly, this incredibly dangerous environment was not solely the domain of adult men. Women and children were extensively employed in coal mines throughout much of the 19th century. Just as in factories, they were prized as a source of cheap labor. Their smaller size was also considered an advantage for working in the narrowest seams and passages where adults could barely fit, another grim exploitation of their physical characteristics for the sake of profit, regardless of the inherent risks. Very young children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, worked as trappers. Their lonely and monotonous task was to sit in the dark by a ventilation door, often for 12 hours straight, opening it when coal tubs needed to pass and then quickly closing it to maintain the crucial air current. They sat alone, often terrified in the cold, damp blackness, their only company the scurrying rats or the distant sounds of the mine, a childhood spent in an almost literal tomb. Slightly older children, along with women, performed the grueling labor of hurriers or drawers. This involved transporting the hewn coal from the coalface to the main roadways or the pit shaft. They would push or pull heavy tubs or corves filled with coal, often weighing several hundred pounds. In many mines, they were fitted with a girdle around their waist and a chain that passed between their legs, crawling on all fours like beasts of burden through low, wet, and uneven tunnels. The physical toll of this back-making labor on women and children was immense and often permanent. The constant strain of hauling heavy loads in contorted positions led to stunted growth, deformed spines and pelvises, chronic muscle and joint pain, and a host of other debilitating injuries. Childbirth could be particularly dangerous for women whose bodies had been misshapen by years of such toil. Their health was sacrificed daily in the quest for coal, their youth eroded by the crushing demands. Beyond the immediate dangers of explosions and collapses and the brutal physical labor, every breath a miner took was laden with fine, abrasive coal dust. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, this black dust settled deep into their lungs, accumulating and solidifying, a slow, insidious poisoning from within. The air underground, thick with these particles, was a constant reminder of the unhealthy exchange, coal for the nation, but at the cost of the miner's own breath. This chronic inhalation of coal dust led to a debilitating and often fatal respiratory disease known as coal workers' pneumoconiosis, or more grimly and descriptively, black lung disease. The coal particles cause inflammation and progressive scarring, fibrosis, of the lung tissue, gradually destroying its elasticity and its ability to transfer oxygen to the blood. It was a disease that crept up slowly, its presence often only becoming fully apparent after years of exposure, its damage irreversible. The symptoms of black lung were unmistakable and distressing. A chronic, hacking cough that often produced black phlegm, increasing shortness of breath even with minimal exertion, chest tightness, and a gradual, inexorable decline in physical capacity. As the disease progressed, sufferers might struggle to walk even short distances, their lives increasingly confined, their breath a precious, hard-won commodity. Eventually, many would die from respiratory failure or related heart complications, a slow, agonizing suffocation. The coal mine, therefore, was a place that consumed human life with a terrifying appetite, sometimes in sudden fiery conflagrations, sometimes through the crushing weight of the earth, and always through the slow, relentless erosion of health from the air breathed. It was an industry built upon extraordinary human suffering, a stark reminder of the brutal realities faced by many workers, deep beneath the earth, where the sun never reached, and where hope itself often seemed a distant, flickering light. While the colossal textile mills and the deep, dark coal mines stand as potent symbols of industrial revolution hardship, it is crucial to remember that the suffering of the working class was not confined to these infamous settings alone. A host of other burgeoning industries, each with its own unique set of perils, exacted a heavy toll on those who labored within them. The relentless drive for innovation and production cast a wide net of misery, ensnaring men, women, and children in a diverse array of dangerous and debilitating occupations, far beyond the loom or the coalface. The dawn of this new industrial age saw the rise of countless workshops and small factories, each contributing to the rapidly changing world and each, all too often, creating its own specific landscape of risk. In these often unregulated spaces, the pursuit of profit frequently overshadowed any meaningful concern for the safety or well-being of the workforce. From the gleaming polish of fine china to the simple convenience of a lucifer match, everyday objects could have their origins in profound human suffering, a hidden cost embedded in their very creation. Let us turn our attention for a moment to the potteries, where clay was transformed into the plates, cups, and decorative items that grace the tables of the more fortunate. While the image of a potter at their wheel might seem almost idyllic, the reality for many workers in the larger ceramic manufactories was far from serene. The air could be thick with fine clay dust, a precursor to lung diseases, but an even more insidious danger lurked in the glazes that gave the pottery its smooth, appealing finish, a danger that attacked the body in a different, equally devastating way. Many of these glazes contained substantial quantities of lead. Workers, including many women and children prized for their supposedly deft touch and decorative work, would handle these lead compounds daily. They might dip the fired pottery into liquid glaze with their bare hands or paint intricate patterns using lead-based colors. The lead, absorbed through the skin or ingested from unwashed hands and contaminated food, slowly, silently, began its poisonous work within their systems, a creeping affliction that could take years to fully manifest its horrors. The consequences of this chronic lead exposure were grievous, leading to a condition often called potter's palsy or painter's colic. Sufferers might experience debilitating tremors, a characteristic drooping of the wrist, and agonizing abdominal pain. More severe cases could progress to paralysis, blindness, kidney failure, and severe neurological damage, including seizures and mental deterioration. For children, lead poisoning had an especially cruel impact, stunting their physical and mental development and casting a long, dark shadow over their already blighted young lives. And as if the threat of lead poisoning were not enough, the pottery workers also contended with the pervasive clay dust, rich in silica. Inhaling these fine, sharp particles day after day, year after year, led, as we have touched upon before in other contexts, to silicosis, or potter's rot. This scarring of the lungs made breathing progressively more difficult, leading to chronic coughs, chest pain, and an increased susceptibility to other respiratory infections. Thus, the pottery worker often faced a dual assault on their health: the slow poisoning of their system and the gradual ruin of their lungs. Another seemingly innocuous industry that concealed a terrible secret was the manufacture of matches. The advent of the friction match, or lucifer, brought a new convenience to daily life, but for those who made them, particularly in the early days using white phosphorus, it brought unimaginable suffering. Young women and children, often working in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms for pitiful wages, were tasked with dipping splints of wood into the volatile phosphorus paste or boxing the finished matches, constantly exposed to its toxic fumes and particles. White phosphorus was a highly toxic substance, and chronic exposure led to a horrifying condition known as phosphorus necrosis of the jaw, or colloquially and chillingly, phossy jaw. It would often begin with a persistent toothache or a swelling of the gums. Then, the jawbone itself would begin to decay, leading to excruciating pain, the loss of teeth, and foul-smelling abscesses. In severe cases, parts of the jawbone would literally die and break away, sometimes glowing with a faint, eerie luminescence in the dark, a ghastly symptom of this industrial disease. The suffering caused by phossy jaw was profound, the disfigurement could be extreme, and the pain relentless. Eating became an agonizing ordeal. The foul discharge from the decaying bone made social interaction almost impossible, isolating the sufferer. While some might eventually recover after surgical removal of the affected bone, many succumbed to infection, complications, or simply the sheer debilitating effects of the disease. It was a gruesome price to pay for the production of a simple household item, a fleeting flame bought with lasting decay. These examples from the potteries and match factories serve to illustrate that the particular brand of misery experienced by factory workers was varied, yet shared common themes of exposure to toxins, dangerous processes, and a general disregard for worker well-being. In chemical works, laborers contended with corrosive acids and noxious fumes that could burn skin and sear lungs. In the metal trades, beyond the immediate danger of machinery, the air in grinding shops was thick with metallic dust, leading to its own forms of lung disease. Glassmaking, an ancient craft, industrialized, exposed workers, including young boys, to furnace temperatures of unbearable intensity, risking severe burns, eye damage from the glare, and chronic respiratory issues from the heated, particle-laden air. The creation of delicate beauty in glass often involved a brutal reality for its makers. Each industry, in its relentless pursuit of output, found new ways to endanger or slowly cripple its workforce, adapting old hazards or inventing new ones specific to its materials and methods. Therefore, as we reflect on why it sucked to be a factory worker during the Industrial Revolution, it becomes clear that the hardship was not an isolated phenomenon confined to the textile giants of Manchester or the coal pits of Wales. It was a pervasive characteristic of industrial labor across a vast spectrum of trades. Whether facing the thunder of looms, the darkness of the mine, the slow poison of lead and phosphorus, or the myriad other dangers lurking in workshops and foundries, workers shared a common experience of exploitation, risk, and the erosion of health in the name of progress. Their collective story is a somber testament to the human cost of an era of unprecedented change. Amidst the relentless grind, the pervasive dangers, and the profound despair that characterized so much of factory life during the Industrial Revolution, it is natural to wonder if any flicker of hope, any resistance, ever pierced the gloom. The answer, though complex and fraught with hardship, is yes. Even in the face of overwhelming power and seemingly insurmountable odds, the human spirit, pushed to its limits, began to stir. These were the early, faint whispers of change, the first tentative steps in a long and arduous journey towards a more just and humane working world. It is crucial to understand, however, that this was not a swift or easy path. The fight for workers' rights was incredibly slow, painstaking, and often met with brutal opposition from those who benefited most from the existing system. The power imbalance between factory owners, backed by the law and the state, and the impoverished, often uneducated workforce was immense. Yet within this oppressive atmosphere, the seeds of collective action and the demand for reform began to tentatively sprout, watered by shared suffering and a dawning awareness of common grievances. Some of the earliest attempts by workers to improve their lot came in the form of trying to band together, to form associations or early forms of unions. These were often small, localized groups, sometimes organized by skilled artisans whose livelihoods were threatened by new machinery or diluted by unskilled labor. Their aims were modest, perhaps to negotiate for slightly better wages, to resist a particularly harsh overseer, or to provide some mutual support for sick or injured members. Even these simple acts of combination, however, were viewed with deep suspicion. Indeed, for a significant period, such attempts at collective bargaining were outright illegal. In Britain, for example, the Combination Acts, enforced during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, effectively outlawed trade unions and made it a criminal offense for workers to organize for better pay or conditions. Those who dared to defy these laws faced fines, imprisonment, or even transportation. This legal hostility forced early labor movements to operate in secret, adding another layer of risk to their already precarious existence, their meetings held in hushed tones, in clandestine locations. Perhaps one of the most misunderstood responses to the hardships of this era was the Luddite movement, which flared up in England between 1811 and 1816. Often portrayed as simply being anti-technology, the Luddites were skilled textile workers who saw new automated machinery, particularly power looms and stocking frames, as a direct threat to their craft, their wages, and their very survival. Their actions, smashing these machines, were born not of a hatred for progress itself, but out of a profound desperation and a sense of powerlessness against forces that were destroying their way of life. The Luddites perceived, often correctly, that these new machines would lead to mass unemployment among skilled artisans, drive down wages for those who remained, and produce inferior goods. Their attacks on machinery were a targeted, symbolic protest, an attempt to halt a process that they believed would lead to widespread destitution for themselves and their families. It was the cry of a community on the brink resorting to direct action because they felt all other avenues of appeal were closed to them, their livelihoods unraveling before their eyes. Parallel to these worker-led efforts, a different kind of change, albeit achingly slow, began to emerge from within the establishment itself. Growing awareness of the appalling conditions, particularly for children, fueled by reports from social reformers, doctors, and even some enlightened factory owners, started to prick the conscience of a segment of society. This led to the first tentative steps towards legislative intervention, the early Factory Acts, which, though deeply flawed and limited, marked a crucial acknowledgement that the state had some role to play in protecting its most vulnerable workers. These initial Factory Acts, beginning in the very early 19th century, were modest in their ambitions and often poorly enforced. The 1802 Act, for instance, applied mainly to pauper apprentices in cotton and woolen mills, attempting to limit their working hours to 12 a day and make some provision for education and accommodation. Later acts would slowly, incrementally extend some protections, such as slightly restricting the hours for very young children in certain textile industries, or prohibiting their employment under a certain age. However, these laws often lacked effective inspection mechanisms, and many employers found ways to circumvent them, the whispers of reform easily drowned out by the roar of profit-driven machinery. As we reflect, the harsh reality of a factory worker's life during the Industrial Revolution is clear. It meant endless 12 to 16-hour days lost to deafening noise and monotonous toil. Danger was a constant companion, from unguarded machines to air thick with dust. Meager pay, eroded by fines, brought little comfort, leading to lives in squalid slums where disease thrived and food was poor. Children especially endured unspeakable hardship, their youth sacrificed to the relentless demands of early industry. This era's immense industrial progress was undeniably built upon the profound human cost of shattered health and shortened lives. It wasn't simply a hard job. For countless men, women, and children, it was an existence defined by a relentless struggle for basic survival against crushing adversity. Their lives were a testament to endurance in an age that often valued machines more than the people who ran them, a somber shadow to the bright dawn of innovation. And so our quiet journey through the shadowed landscapes of the past reaches its gentle conclusion. Let the images of the bustling factories, the clatter of machinery, and the weary figures of those who toiled there begin to softly recede from your thoughts. Leave the noise and dust behind now. Allow them to drift away, settling back into the silent depths of history. These stories, though filled with hardship, are now but faint echoes from a time long gone. As you find yourself returning to the comforting stillness of your own peaceful surroundings, far removed from that era of unceasing labor and struggle, the burdens of that age are not yours to carry tonight. The immense struggles we have recounted, the daily fight for survival against such odds, can cast a somber reflection. Yet, that world of relentless demand and scarce comfort is now a distant shore. As you rest in your present moment, embraced by quiet and safety, may the contrast spark a gentle appreciation for the solace you now possess. The simple luxury of a comfortable bed, the peace of an undisturbed night, the freedom to welcome sleep as a restorative friend, these were blessings often denied to those whose lives we've touched upon. For accompanying us through these boring yet important histories, we sincerely thank you. May they have brought a measure of calm. Let any final thoughts of that bygone era now dissolve like mist in the morning sun. There is nothing more to hold on to from that past, nothing to disturb your peace. Your journey for tonight is complete. Focus now only on your breath, on the feeling of release, on the gentle pull towards slumber. Drift quietly now, drift deeply, allow the soft enveloping darkness to cradle you, and the gentle tide of sleep to carry you effortlessly into a world of peaceful dream. Good night, and may your rest be profound and untroubled. Sleep well,